Hello everyone, as always, I'm Vlad Sparastoria and I know things about shooting, and this beautiful pistol is a Browning double action. But the more attentive among you might say, but Vlad, this is clearly a Beretta 81. Actually, that's not quite the case, because if you squint your eyes and start looking at the details of this weapon, you'll notice that there are some substantial differences. With the Beretta 81, the truth is that this, mechanically speaking, is 90% a Beretta 81. But it features modifications requested by Browning Arms, and what's more, it's produced 100% in Italy by Beretta. But why did a big company like Browning and actually the Belgian Fabrique Nationale go to Beretta to ask them to produce a pistol for them? First of all, let's clarify a small thing. Browning and Fabrique Nationale, the Belgian Fabrique Nationale, has had a lot of success in its history thanks to John Moses Browning and his company. And the history of the two has always been strongly linked, right from the very beginning. And at a certain point, actually, the Belgian Fabrique Nationale went directly to acquire to buy after the death of John Moses. Browning, the American Browning. And in fact, the two companies operate, one for the European market and a bit more military. Fabrique Nationale and Browning focus a bit more on the American market and the hunting aspect. But this isn't always the case. One doesn't always exclude the other. In short, they are two brands of the same group in a certain sense. Fabrique Nationale Browning in the 1970s had a lot of firearms in its catalog, many excellent firearms, but it targeted a certain type of clientele. At that time, Fabrique Nationale in particular was focusing a lot on military contracts. These are the years, for example, when the American Army adopts their Fabrique Nationale mag as the M240, a fantastic machine gun, one of the best Fabrique Nationale products ever made, while there were still Fabrique Nationale files in production. These companies were already thinking about the future, experimenting with what was supposed to become the assault rifle of the new millennium. And in the lineup, let's say in the production catalog of Fabrique Nationale Browning, the pistols had fallen a bit behind. As for the 9mm, the Fabrique Nationale High Power was being sold, a pistol we've talked about a lot on this channel, and personally, I love it. In the 1970s, it still wasn't that old, even though at that time the other so-called Wonder 9s were coming out. First of all, the Beretta 90 series. Well, pistols with a slightly smaller caliber, like the 380 automatic Colt pistol or the 7.65 Browning, struggled quite a bit. In fact, the most modern pistol in the Fabrique Nationale Browning catalog at that time was the Fabrique Nationale 1910-22. We've also talked about this one on the channel, which in terms of design, ergonomics, and technology, wasn't exactly the most modern of the semi-automatics. It worked, but from that moment on, technology had made great strides, and Fabrique Nationale Browning was also struggling a bit, with a problem that might seem technically silly to us now, but it's actually a clever solution. I mean, the solution is obvious once you find it, but until you do, it's a bit difficult. Well, they struggled to develop a good weapon with a good double-action trigger like the Fabrique Nationale 1910, like the Browning High Power. They were all single-action weapons, while the concept of double-action was becoming more and more popular in the 1970s. You see again the Beretta 90 series with its double-action trigger, you see the CZ75, you see the SIG 220, and so on. In short, double-action at that time on a semi-automatic pistol was a must. And frankly, Browning Fabrique Nationale had their hands completely full with military contracts. However, they couldn't miss out on a slice of the market, which was very important. The story of this Browning double-action weapon begins with another pistol that, very confusingly, is also called the Browning double-action. And it has exactly nothing in common with this one. Just to confuse us even more, there's a third pistol called Browning double-action, which has nothing to do with the first two. But we'll get to that. So, in the 1970s, a Swiss company, SIG, developed a new and interesting pistol, the SIG 220. The SIG 220 still wasn't perfect. Simply put, it was single stack, while real success would come with a double stack magazine. But it was a very interesting design that was used for the first time in the world. What is described as the SIG system, that is with the locking in the ejection port, which is kind of a standard in modern semi-automatic pistols. The Swiss government, however, for purely political reasons, did not want SIG to sell these weapons abroad. What will SIG do? SIG will buy a German company that at that time was having some financial difficulties, but was still healthy and had production capacity. Sauer. This is how SIG Sauer will be born. For the simple reason of producing their weapons in Germany, the Germans had no problem exporting these weapons they produced. And so SIG was happy. The Swiss government had been given the middle finger. However, this name Sauer was a new name, and to start production, they were willing to accept various contracts. Or don't you spit in the eyes of those who feed you? Well, Fabrique Nationale Browning actually thought about having the Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft 220 produced in 45 caliber, which had a good double-action trigger, and sell it under their name, under the Browning name, in America. So essentially, Americans had a product that was in 45 caliber, their beloved caliber. The 9mm hadn't been adopted yet, so 45 was the standard American service caliber, a system they knew well, but the Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft 220 was very modern, with modern ergonomics and a double-action trigger. And above all, with an important name like John Moses. Browning, perfect for the American market. It would have sold much worse if it had had a German name at that time. These Browning double-action 45s also began to cement the very good reputation of SIG Sauer at that time. As you well know, the SIG 226, a double-stacked 9mm version, would be one of the great almost winners of the American competition, which was then won by the Beretta 92. Another product they made specifically for that market, for those looking for a pocket pistol, for those looking for a pistol in 380 automatic Colt pistol, in particular, or in Europe, the 7.65 Browning. They asked Beretta for a collaboration, which Beretta gladly accepted, but requested some modifications. In fact, these pistols are not perfectly identical to the Beretta 81 many parts, like the magazines, for example. We'll test this during the live fire test. They are perfectly interchangeable, but other details in the trigger mechanism in particular, as well as in the slide, are not exactly the same. These pistols will be sold exclusively in 380 automatic Colt pistol in America, so much so that they are known as Browning Double Action 380, partly to distinguish them from the first Browning Double Action. The copy, well, not even the copy, the one produced by SIG. We should say, let's emphasize, I'm just mentioning the third Browning Double Action. The third Browning Double Action will arrive in the 1980s and will essentially be a version of the high power, with a completely new trigger mechanism. Again, just to confuse us, remember when you talk about the Browning Double Action, which of the three completely different pistols are you actually talking about? Let's do one thing though, let's move the camera and take a closer look at how it's made. How is the Beretta 81 different? Also because we'll find some very interesting things. Then we'll come back here to the shooting range lines at the Legnano Shooting Club, and of course we'll test it from a distance. The Browning Double Action looks just like a Beretta 81, but first of all, if we take a Beretta 81, we'll start to see the very first differences. The most obvious one, even from far away, is also the one that makes people raise an eyebrow when they see this gun. It's the slide. In fact, with the Browning Double Action, we have a traditional fully enclosed slide, except for the ejection port, which in its look actually reminds you a lot more of traditional pistols. Let me explain. The open slide of the Beretta, this slide where the barrel remains mostly exposed, and there's this large opening for ejection. It's a very specific look. From a distance, you can easily recognize the Beretta's signature in this slide. It's not a technical solution you see very often. It has its advantages, but also its disadvantages, obviously, like everything, like every piece of technology. But there's no doubt that even someone who's not really interested in firearms thinks of the Italian weapon. When we see these lines, these designs, we immediately think of Italy and Beretta. Well, not always necessarily. This can be considered an advantage for everyone, especially if someone sells pistols specifically to the American market under the Browning name, maybe even in appearance, making them look a bit more traditional, not to hide the fact that they're Italian, but almost, so to speak. Then, I repeat, there are technical reasons why you might prefer a closed slide. A more protected barrel, in theory, means less dirt getting in. The other big difference we immediately notice compared to the Beretta 81 is the position of the safety. Now, in the Beretta 81, strictly speaking, this safety functions only as a safety, that's it. You surely know very well that in versions like the 84 chambered in .380 automatic Colt pistol, the safety also acts as a decocker, even though it's still on the frame. Well, the Browning double action has it on the slide, just like the Beretta 90 series would later do, and just like Smith & Wesson was doing at that time with their semi-automatic pistols. At that time, it was considered that simply having a safety on the slide would be, let's say, the next big thing. After all, the American Army would later adopt a weapon with the safety on the slide. Now we can debate whether decocking safeties are better on the slide or on the frame. Frankly, I prefer them on the frame rather than on the slide, but maybe back then people thought differently. We also have to respect this, that the thinking was going in that direction. With hindsight, Paulie, the Army's markings appear first on the left side. We can clearly see the name of the company that sold this pistol, so the Browning Arms Company based in Utah. We also find the designation of the model Browning Double Action 380. I already mentioned it in the introduction. The model is called 380. They were only available in 380, that is the 9 short for the American market, but for the European market where the 9 short wasn't always legal. Personally, in Italy, it was legal. They were made in 765. In fact, this one is in 765, which we can also see written on the ejection port. 32 Auto 765, while on the slide, we also find the Beretta logo. And the Made in Italy, of course. Then for the Italian market of that time in particular, there's a catalog number. Today, as you surely know, the decocking safety has been removed to demonstrate how it works. It obviously allows us, when engaged, to safely lower the hammer of the firearm. There's another big difference in how these two firearms work that I want to show you, by the way, a difference in operation that seems almost obvious to us. If we know the Browning High Power, do you remember what particular type of safety the Browning High Power uses? Our Beretta 81. Clearly, obviously, it's unloaded. Let's pull the trigger. It fires even without the magazine, and you might say, well, isn't that how it should be? Yes, if it weren't for the fact that the Browning double action, just like the High Power, has a magazine safety. With the magazine removed, you can't do anything at all. The hammer drops, the decocker works, but even the double action doesn't work. As you can see, it's completely disconnected. You have to insert the magazine to reconnect the trigger mechanism, which is a somewhat questionable choice. I'm not a big fan, either conceptually or practically, of the magazine safety, but I repeat, it was kind of a Browning trademark at that time. So maybe if someone already had an A-Power and knew the system, they would find the handling familiar in the pocket version, which from a marketing point of view for the end user could make sense. Let's take a look at how it's made. Inside, it disassembles exactly like a Beretta Series 80, so we've obviously checked that it's unloaded and we've removed the magazine. We can press this button on the left side of the gun, which will allow us to rotate the takedown lever like this. Here we can separate the frame of the gun from the barrel, slide, and recoil spring. We can further remove the recoil spring and then take out the barrel. Let's first take a look at the frame because I want to show you how the magazine safety works. What did they add? They didn't really change the design much. But let's see if I can show you, because with the camera you have to get it right. Here it is, the right angle. You see that in the frame. Let's see if I can show it to you. I hope you can see it. But there's a spring here. You can see it a little bit right now. Unfortunately, the lighting is what it is. You'll notice this is the frame I removed from the Beretta 91. It doesn't have this element inside. It's completely smooth. How does this mechanism work? This spring inside the magazine well constantly pushes the transfer bar down, which is this element that's connected to the trigger. As you can see, when I pull the trigger, the bar moves, and at this point, the bar should hook onto another notch. The bar, at this point. You see, there's another notch here that continues the firing chain, but it's too low to touch it. Do you see what happens when I insert the magazine? Now the bar rises up and the contact elements finally touch each other and the weapon can fire. If I remove the magazine, the spring pushes the transmission bar down, which is too low to engage the mechanism. By the way, you can also simulate this with your finger. As you can see, you can push pretty hard near the top of that spring, then let it snap into its correct position and reconnect the firing mechanism. Other differences that we can identify between the two weapons. Simply put, the Browning double action, as you can see here, has a hammer decocking mechanism that is very similar to that of the Beretta 90 series. Recoil, spring, and barrel are 100% identical. Now I would need a caliper to measure all the parts, clearly. The main differences are again in the slide, with the presence of the mechanisms to decock the hammer on the Browning double action. And above all, very clearly, we can see here from this position just how different the slide of the Beretta 81 is. So let's reassemble our very simple gun like the 81 series. With the 80 series, you put the barrel back in, and then you can reinsert the recoil spring. With its guide rod, we can then join the two parts together. We simply place the gun on the slide on its rails and we can close the assembly latch. Here we go. Of course, I needed to cock the gun, but I need the magazine. Let's finally go test it properly. Let's finally fire a few rounds with our Browning double action. We're at a fairly close target, about 7 meters, which is actually pretty typical for these defense pistols. Let's insert the magazine, chamber the first round, and see if it works. Okay, go, it works. Let's try something else right away, because the question will come up. Are the magazines really compatible? Let's test it. We have the magazine, our Beretta 81, we can try it right away. They work. So let's do one thing. Let me load some more rounds, shoot again, and I'll tell you right away what I think. So, first impressions, obviously it's practically identical to a Beretta 81, and we really shouldn't have any doubts about that. The differences are really minimal, I'll tell you in the end. Not so much from an aesthetic point of view. But the slide being closed here and not open like on the Beretta, I like it. But for a very simple reason. Now, there are many shooting techniques and various shooters, even over the years. But even in terms of geography, in Italy rather than in another country, they might use different gun handling techniques. We could also spend a lot of time discussing which one is more correct or less correct, and many people do this constantly. But I tend, especially in recent years, to almost always use the power stroke, so I basically grab the slide with my hand cupped. And I'm not saying that this is a bit more comfortable when the slide is so rounded around the barrel of the gun, but it is a little bit. Not that with the Beretta, let me grab it, I have it right here next to me, not that with the Beretta 81, this thing is impossible. But there is always a small risk that you might pinch your hand in this big opening. It's not a big problem, I repeat, but just a little bit. I personally prefer the aesthetics of the 81. With the slide open, it's definitely more classic and better, but maybe at first impression, when handling it, it's also a bit easier to find this slide. Or is that something specific to this technique? The checkering on this gun is notable, especially given when it was made. Back then, people tended to rack the slide by grabbing it with two hands, with 2 fingers on the checkering and pulling it back. From this point of view, there's no difference between the two guns. Let's fire a few more rounds because I want to try the decocker, just to remind myself how the trigger on the Beretta feels. Series 80, or rather properly now, the Browning double action, with the decocker that actually resembles the Series 90 more. Also because normally the Series 80 has the safety or possibly the decocker on the frame, while this one has it on the slide just like its bigger sisters. The 90s lets chamber around, decock the hammer, and try the double action. They go straight, they go straight. Let's try again. The trigger pull is nice and long, but nothing unmanageable. I'll tell you something interesting. It has excellent double action, which isn't much different from the single action. I'm not sure if that's an insult to the single action, which is a bit heavy, relatively, but definitely both are very smooth with a very crisp break. There is a... Lately, many people discriminate against the good old 765 Browning. Pistols in this category, on one hand, it's true. In the last 10 years, many 9mm semi-automatics have come out on the market that are this size or even smaller. These are the modern subcompact ones that I've mentioned several times myself. The SIG P365, the Fabrique Nationale Reflex, the Glock 43. There are a lot of them, in short, in this category, which has pushed this category of pistols a bit, like the Beretta 81, like the Browning double action, into their, I wouldn't say oblivion, but definitely into their own niche. I assure you that for self-defense purposes, there is nothing wrong or insufficiently powerful about the 765 Browning. And we could argue at most, however, whether the 9 or the 380 is better. Actually, let me know in the comments if you're interested in me discussing the 765 Browning versus the 9 short, which is better, the advantages and disadvantages. But I'll tell you, a weapon like this, light and compact, is very manageable in terms of recoil. Except for 2 or 3 shots that went off target during the slightly faster shooting. They're all basically there. I would just need to practice a bit more, maybe to become a champion. There's nothing wrong with it when it comes to doing what it's supposed to do, which is basically being a self-defense pistol. Thank you all for watching this video. As always, remember that these videos are made possible by you. First of all, as collectors who offer me the firearms, or like the shooting range in Legnano that brought out its armory, its collection, this firearm today, to let me try it. Without the help of people and institutions like you, these videos of mine would truly be impossible to make. If you're interested in contributing directly, consider subscribing to the channel. This helps me cover costs that are not earned at all through YouTube. It allows you to access exclusive content and know that it will also give you priority access very soon to a great initiative I'm preparing. If you want to contribute to the channel for free, don't forget to leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to me as a content creator. This helps a lot and it's free for you. When I offend your favorite weapon, you can always remove the like from me. And from the Legnano shooting range, that's all with this Browning double action. As always, I'll see you next time.